response, I think ways of finding and forming, sustaining communities are part of any future mobilization. Right? People don't mobilize from nowhere. They mobilize through established bonds, and some of the sorting out of those modes of community are really, really crucial. It does seem to me that there are, I don't know if one has to ask who the enemy is. I mean, it may not be that the enemy is embodied in a single person or in that way. So if there's no man who's representing sovereign power, what is it one is struggling against? And it seems to me that struggling against gender-based violence, struggling against violence that black women and black lesbians in particular suffer, or struggling for housing activism, or even struggling in some way to complete the downfall of apartheid at its cultural and social levels. I mean, that's what I'm hearing. That's part of what people are struggling against. And then the question is, how local are those actions? How allied are they? What kind of networks get formed? What kind of intervention in public culture and public media is possible? I think it's probably a new kind of political practice, yeah? I'll be really interested to see how it goes.
To what extent can one manage the danger of preconditions or assumptions about grievable life? Why am I asking this question is that it's kind of difficult for me as a black person, or as an individual, if you like, or I'm very uncomfortable in determining what life is grievable, or whose life to grieve. And I just wanted to explain that. Thank you.
It's of course not possible to grieve every life in its singularity, right? And sometimes we're confronted with mass death or with losses of enormous proportion, and it happens in situations of natural disaster or famine or genocide or war and or disease, and the real question is, how is it that we can think about modes of public acknowledgement or memorialization that refuse to stigmatize those losses or to disavow those losses? And very often it becomes important if people die from diseases that are stigmatized, or if people die in wars where they have already been devalued or derealized by virtue of becoming war targets. And I think that it's very sad that we can ask the question, who is grievable, right? It should be an impossible question to ask. It should be presumed that everyone is grievable. And it should, but the only reason we ask it is because we're trying to understand within a certain scheme of power how it is that certain lives are treated as more worthy and as more grievable, more worthy of open public mourning than others, and why it is that certain losses are disavowed and effaced. And if we didn't have that power differential, we wouldn't ask the question. So we ask the question not because we want to answer it for ourselves, oh, let me decide who's grievable and who's not. We want to ask the question in order to make the question impossible. That's the whole reason to ask the question.
I'm Judith Butler. My name's Darren. First, I'm a first-year law student at the University of Stellenbosch. I apologize for my current speech impairment, but I recently had my wisdom teeth removed. in South Africa at the moment, there's a particular fear of being labeled racist. Even as I stand here today, I was contemplating expressing this opinion for that fear of being labeled racist. Because if you express your opinion and it's misunderstood by people and you are labeled racist, especially in the new South Africa, you are excommunicated from your society, you're frowned upon and whatnot. I won't mention the university's name that I applied to last year or didn't apply for fear that they will think I'm defamating them. But when I went onto their application page, I found that they had entirely separate pages and entirely separate application processes depending on your color, and that there was even different, not faculties, but branches depending on your color. And personally, even though I understood that their movement towards a sort of empowerment, which was necessary, had become diluted to me as a white man or white teenage boy, and I had confused it with a sort of discrimination, because I personally felt, or I feel at the time, that it was misunderstood in the sense that it was the entrance requirements, depending on your skin color, were not based upon your demographics of where you stay. For example, if a person staying in a place that doesn't have electricity can get 70%, I fully understand. But when the person in the very same area and class as you has far easier entrance requirements, you begin to question it. And I realized that I am a single person, and that maybe I'm naive and that I'm youthful and I don't have the full picture, but surely I represent a large part of my country's demographic. And if me personally, as an educated person, can feel a bitterness, surely that's dangerous in our country. And I find that personally, like, as a white South African boy now, there's not really like a place or a council that I can go and speak to for the exact reason that people go, you're racist, even though that's not what I am or who I feel. And I'm just wondering, like, how does a person sort of overcome that? I mean, how do you get around that?
Yeah.
Really appreciate it.
So let's just first mark one thing about the question, which is that you're asking this of a U.S. intellectual who's, just arrived in the country, and I'm not the adjudicator, right? And the U.S. too often understands itself as the adjudicator when it actually is in need of profound adjudication itself. I found myself asking the following question: would it matter if instead of asking the question, am I racist or am I not racist, or if I don't understand this admissions process and I have questions about its legitimacy, am I therefore racist? Maybe there's a different kind of question, a larger question, which is what kind of obligation does an educational institution have in post-apartheid South Africa to establish opportunities for those who've been traditionally excluded from those educational institutions, and what notions of equality are we committed to, and how might they best be achieved? And I know this is a kind of general question, but I think one question I would ask you is what kind of country you want to live in, whether you represent a demographic, as you say, or whether you represent an aspiration to live in a country that increasingly overcomes its racial and class stratifications, and what role educational institutions have in that struggle, in that continuing struggle. I think it depersonalizes the issue. It might also help you to feel a little less victimized and remind us of the larger questions of equality and empowerment that are at issue here.
speak of alliances, when I hear that, I think of interests. My interest and your interest combined in an alliance, and it makes me wonder what happened to solidarity. I came of age politically in the solidarity movements in North America, and the sense that the other person's subjugation or oppression or vulnerability or precarity was at least as significant as mine, if not more, and that should spur me into action. And it seems that one of the forms of power of the anti-apartheid resistance movement that didn't get reiterated properly was this idea of comradeship. And I don't know that alliances, if they're interest-based, if that's what you mean, is going to get us there, and I have big questions about how that kind of solidarity could once again be inspirational after all.
Okay. Well, again, it may be that my own locatedness inflects my thinking here in ways that limit the transposability of my thinking on this issue. But I'm actually planning to think about solidarity, alliance, and cohabitation in the next months. When I refer to alliance, I don't refer to an interest-based collection of people. I have this interest, you have this interest. I'm actually interested in what it means to live together and to work together, and in what sense there might be forms of belongingness without which we can't even conceive of ourselves as distinct individuals with distinct interests. But one feature of that belongingness that interests me is that it's very often fraught with difficulty. So for instance, in some of my recent work, I've been trying to think about precarious life as implying a kind of interdependency, that one life is not just dependent on another, but that our individual lives don't make sense without reference to a social life or a life together. And which isn't to say that a life together collapses or refuses that singularity, but that there's a kind of interconnectedness that's very difficult and very essential. And what I'm assuming is that living together, working together, and every form of interdependency has both forms of passionate engagement and enormous difficulty. Because dependency itself is both necessary for a livable life and sometimes feels unlivable, right? It's the source, interestingly enough, of livability and unlivability. And so I'm thinking about what kinds of implications that has for people who must work together, who actually have animosity or who really wish they didn't have to, but they are tied together and their fates are tied together, right? It's one issue that comes up a lot when you think about Israel-Palestine and what kinds of alliances are possible or what kind of future for that region is possible to imagine. And it's an uneasy, sometimes a wretched form of cohabitation, and the question is how to transform that into something less wretched and more livable. So I have found that political alliances tend to suffer if they start with the idea that there has to be an absolute unanimity of views. Like if everybody has to agree on the same term, on the same tactic, on the same self-understanding, it's going to break. It's going to break unless you have a super bad enemy out there that's keeping you together, right? But when your super bad enemy goes, right, then it's like, oh. Then if your enemy's not localized or embodied in that way, even then, the question of disunity and désaccord. Discord. I don't know why that came in. So the question is how to hang together even in discord. And I feel like I don't know if the word solidarity still works there. Maybe it does. Maybe it's a new version of solidarity I'm looking for. But for me, solidarity has very often demanded kind of absolute unity.